Right, well, welcome back everybody. Hope you managed to grab yourself a coffee. Chris Miles and Jonathan O'Neill are joining us now, Commercial Director of the Fire Protection Association. Chris Miles and Jonathan O'Neill, Managing Director of the Fire Protection Association. Now, I've been looking forward particularly to this one. They're all good sessions today, but this one is of interest to me because I didn't know until recently that the people who do the fire testing on products, or the organisation that does it, is not the same as the organisation that do the certification. Now, we're all, I think, used to BBA certificates, but apparently the test is carried out by a testing house, for example, the BRE in the Fire Research Testing Station, and the product information in terms of its performance in that test is then taken off to a certification agency who write the certificate. And in there may be some ambiguities or inaccuracies in that certification. I was astonished to learn that these were two relatively separate activities. I may have not quite understood it correctly. Therefore, I'm looking forward to hearing from Chris and Jonathan to find out how far I was right or wrong. Chris has over 30 years' experience in the testing, assessment and certification of fire-resisting construction products. So he's going to have absolutely the right experience here, and we're into fire-resisting door sets, and products, etc., all through the building. A graduate of economics and history, Jonathan O'Neill began his professional life in the insurance industry and has been managing director of the Fire Protection Association since it separated from the Loss Prevention Council in 1999. And he's based down in that wonderful building they've got at Morton in the Marsh. So, Chris and Jonathan, over to you. I understand, as you come online, that we're going to be looking at the reaction to fire testing, fire performance of external cladding systems, fire resistance testing, and it's going to be a running order of a brief introduction from both of you, and then a 15-minute joint presentation, brief introduction, sorry, I've given to both of you, a 15-minute joint presentation by you with some 20 slides or so, and then we're going to have 15-minute Q&A. So everybody at home or in your office or wherever you are on the beach in Australia, keep those questions rolling in. I'll be watching them on this right-hand screen. That's why I turn away from time to time, and I'll try and, again, group them into meaningful sets as we get this conversation rolling. Over to you, Chris and Jonathan, and welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody. And my name's Chris Miles. For those that are on the beach in Australia, what the heck are you doing watching this instead of sunbathing or surfing or whatever? Yes, as Paul explained, hopefully you understand myself and Jonathan's kind of role in this a little bit. Both of us work for the Fire Protection Association. John for a long time, me for a short time. But we're going to try and cover a very technical subject. So testing and certification of fire systems for use in the construction industry, particularly looking at reaction to fire, cladding systems and fire resistance testing. No doubt many or all of you have been involved in all of those three requirements, those characteristics, if we could call them, in designing fire safety. We could talk for hours on these and allied topics. Obviously, we can't do that today. We're going to try and stick with 15 minutes if we can, and then enable 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Just really harking back to the first, as a way of introduction, to the first presentation for those of you that made it this morning, from Colin from the HSE. He noted that the new gateway process shows that the designer should ensure compliance for fire safety and provide the supporting evidence. That's really, really challenging. I'm going to show you, or John and I are going to show you why that's challenging, and perhaps some ways that you can help yourselves through that process. So, jumping straight into reaction to fire testing, couple of aspects to this. One is inside a building, and how we would classify the inside of a building, and then John will come on to the external cladding shortly. It's a really technical subject. It's only small scale testing generally, probably no more than 2 meters high when we're looking at the inside of buildings. And in this case, for reaction to fire, we're looking at the combustibility, ignitability of a single material, generally a single material. It interacts with the substrate that it's on there. The color of it can influence its performance. Many other factors can influence the performance. The way I look at reaction to fire testing within a building is a small waste paper basket in the corner of the room catching fire, and what happens to the linings of that building. And we'll come back to that analogy later on. But do the walls propagate the fire and spread it up and along their surfaces? Does the ceiling do the same? Does the floor do the same? There's a number of test methods that are used to get to a classification, and it's the classification which is used in approved document B, which then you would be looking at depending on where you use it in a building, on what type of building it is, etc., etc. The classification is based on EN 13501 Part 1, and I'll apologise now for throwing lots of numbers at you, etc., etc. But that Part 1 bit is really important. We often get asked at the Fire Protection Association to do a test in accordance with 13501. That covers a multitude of products, from fire resistance products, reaction to fire, obviously, ducting and damper type products, so ventilation things. So it's really important we use that -1. And when we get to that classification, we'll look at the main fire performance, smoke classification, and flaming droplets classification. Okay, it's missing out a couple of slides, so not to worry. There's within the classifications, there's a whole series of from A to F classes. A1 products will not contribute to the fire growth, so non-combustible. So A1 is pretty much non-combustible completely. A2, the wording is it will not significantly contribute to the fire growth. So they don't contribute that much, but they do a little bit. And actually, for external buildings, we'll come on to it, you can use either of those options. And then the further down the alphabet we go, B, C, D, it's in a diminishing returns basis. So that's within inside a building. I'm going to hand over to John in a second, who will take us through the outside of building, and obviously part of the reason we're all here today talking about fire safety was because we got it wrong in some of the recent exterior aspects of buildings. John.
Okay, and thanks for that, Chris, and thanks, Paul, for the introduction. As far as the fire performance of external cladding systems, what's the interest? Well, quite clearly, the fire in June 2017 woke the world up to the fact actually the fire performance of external cladding systems was important. For those of you who don't know, the Fire Protection Association's history is very much associated with the British insurance industry. They were our founders, and they still play a major part on our board. And in fact, immediately after the Grenfell fire, insurers asked us for our advice about where they should go with external cladding. Clearly, the view we all had immediately post Grenfell was the systems had to comply with certain regulations, and so the expectation was that a large-scale test would have been performed, an 8414 test on that system, and the system would have passed to allow it to be put on that building. In our view, the system was the 8414 test was not perfect in any way, shape, or form, and when we looked at it, there was some serious problems. Now, clearly, as the slide shows, it goes back to the requirements of approved document B, but it certainly goes an awful lot further than that as far as the insurers are concerned. For many years, many of you will be aware that the insurance industry has put its own rules and regulations in as far as sprinkler systems and other fire protection systems. It's not been quite so tough on the fire resistance requirements of buildings, because it's really looked for building regulations to do that. I think Grenfell highlighted another issue, and the insurance industry then began to look a lot more closely at external systems and see whether the current testing system was fit for purpose. We knew that there would be a review of the 8414 system. And so FBA was actually commissioned by the ABI to look at the standard itself. We looked at several different aspects. We looked at the fuel loads, because in work that we'd done, particularly on curtain wall systems, we'd found that some of the fuel loads that were used in testing didn't really take account of a modern lifestyle. So there was an awful lot of plastic involved in the fuel load of modern buildings, whereas most of the cribs that are used for reaction to fire resistance testing are wood. Actually, when we did the two comparative tests with an open burn, including some plastic and looking at the full wood crib, we actually found the full wood crib was a pretty good test actually for 8414. So we sort of parked that and said, yeah, okay, we think that's generally okay. More worrying for us was the breaching of the cladding system by unstopped vents and ducts. And very, very early on in the Grenfell investigation, I think it became quite clear that toxicity issues were a problem for the residents that were caught in that tower block. And the 8414 test has no requirement there. Our work sort of confirmed that needed more looking at. Similarly, we needed to look at the oxygen provision to materials for the allowance of the chimney effect. We looked at the performance of cavity barriers, and we looked importantly, and as Paul said in his introduction, the differences between the certification and the in-use applications. We were very, very concerned that some of the tests, the test allowed for almost perfect conditions, and for people, and we've seen this, I think, within the Grenfell inquiry, for some gaming of the system, particularly where actually people put cavity barriers in the most advantageous place to ensure they got a test pass. We released that report. It went into PSI. There was a review of 8414, and some changes were made, but certainly not enough. And I think the important thing to stress here is that insurers are not convinced any longer that the 8414 test, even the modified 8414 test, is enough of an indicator to give them any satisfaction that there is the level of non-combustibility or fire resistance that they require in the external system. So in the new year, we're likely to see an 8414 plus. I'm calling it 8414 plus. It will almost certainly have a different name. But it will look, it'll be a stiffer test. And it's for those of you who remember FBA's origins being back at the FPC, you'll know that the loss prevention standards, insurance standards, have always been there to look at property protection as well as life safety. And I think what we like to see within that new standard is some open state cavity barrier test done before the 8414 test. We are likely to have fixed cavity barrier positioning. There's a material identification test, which we've actually now been doing at the FBA for about 6 or 7 months. So we actually can give a chemical fingerprint of all of the insulation materials that we use in the test sample, so that we know we can give some reassurance to property owners and to specifiers that the stuff that we tested is the same stuff that they're putting on the sides at the end of buildings. We're looking at the measurement of field of debris, because that's clearly important, particularly for firefighting and evacuation purposes. We're looking, as I said, at the introduction of penetrations such as extract ducts. And again, I touched on the measurement of toxicity. But most importantly, we're looking at the certification of manufacturers and installers. And Paul quite rightly, made that distinction between the test houses and the certification bodies. A lot of the certification bodies have their own test houses, and they do a perfectly adequate job. But we do have UCAS accredited test organisations, FPA is one of them, that will allow its tests to go to any UCAS accredited third party certification body to ensure that the installers are properly accredited, and that's an important distinction. It is, it's not just the design and of the system and the manufacture of the components. It's absolutely vital that the thing is installed as it's been tested, and any variations are properly noted. Chris.
Thanks, John. So I'll elaborate shortly on the testing versus certification aspect.
Yeah. Before you kick off there, Chris.
I'm sorry.
Before you kick off there, we're down to 10 minutes left in this session. It's been rich and good, but I do want to get some questions to you. So can you skim over these slides pretty quickly so that we can get
I kind of want to do that, Paul. Yes.
Okay, great. Fire away.
So I'll touch on fire resistance testing. Imagine our basket inside a room has caught fire. It's spread to the walls and the lining. The whole room is ablaze. If it stays within that room, it's probably not an issue, but it's going to stay in that room because the walls and floor and door and windows are fire resistant. They stop it spreading outside of that room of origin. That's what we mean when we look at fire resistance testing. We evaluate it by different classes, such as R for load bearing, E for integrity. It's on there, as you can see. The one kind of, I am rattling through these, but taking a few specifics from approved document B, you'll see where it references those classes. Just one letter either way, omitting the R, omitting the E, can be significant and can give us a completely different type of product. Similarly with that, I'll skip over the next one. I just wanted us to touch on, because Paul mentioned it before about certification, and actually there's a whole series of factors here which causes issues about the test data. When we get supplied test data, how do we know it's valid? Is it right that that's relevant, the data that was tested 10 years ago for the product that's actually coming to site now, who's going to install it, etc., etc. Actually, the answer to that is in product or installer certification. Those bodies are evaluated independently rather than just relying on a test to prove the performance. There's a whole series of other aspects that get caught up in certification, such as factory visits, such as ongoing testing, such as independent reviews of the data. So we're often asked lately, especially post Grenfell, can somebody do a test on this product? Actually, that means very little. It means that specific product at that specific time will work. Doesn't mean on an ongoing basis it will work. So actually the answer to many of these questions, the ones I just raised in the prior slide, are all covered by certification of the product or by the installer. And I think it's really important that a lot of the needs for you to prove compliance are actually taken care of by using certification of the product or certification of the installer. It's actually passing on the responsibility then from you to somebody else to say, you've done your bit. I've asked for tested, certificated products. I've asked for certificated installers. My responsibility is done. It's now down to somebody else to prove that they can satisfy those needs. Gosh, and breathe.
Okay, good. Well, we've got a good range of questions rolling in here, but can we get to the bottom of one thing? Because architects and others who specify, we're not lawyers. And when you look at the way in which, say, a standard BBA certificate may be laid out, the information can be substantial within that document. It can be 8 or 10 pages long, and some of the information may even be conflicting because it's summarized at the front and then it's given in more detail later on within the document. The first point I suppose I'd say, ask you, is that if anybody is specifying a product, let's just say it's a roofing felt, move away from fire. You know, it's roofing felt can catch fire, but I'm talking about, you know, its performance as a roofing felt to keep the weather out. Anybody using a BBA certificate should presumably, you would say, read it entirely front to back, as opposed to the front page. That's a yes/no question, I think.
Then it's a yes answer.
Okay. Now, if they're doing that, that document should surely be, and I'm making a plea on behalf of those of us that have to read them, in clear language. That is absolutely essential, isn't it?
It comes down to competence, Paul, though, doesn't it? If we're expecting somebody to use that evidence, are they competent to do that? And I'm sure through today's seminar that C word is going to keep coming back and back and back. We've heard it a few times already. If people aren't competent to use that information, they shouldn't be doing it. I wouldn't drive a car if I'm not competent to do it.
Well, that's a really good point you make there. On the other hand, that information should certainly, in its expression, be beyond ambiguity. And I think that's a point that many specifiers would say they have difficulty with, because the information is not beyond, it's not as clear as it should be. Can you just tell me, who are the testing stations? And if we stay with fire now, if you're a manufacturer and you want a product tested, you've got to have a test carried out in accordance with testing standards and guidelines to meet whichever BS it's going to be. But where do you go to get products tested? How many testing stations are there? We know about the BRE, Fire Research Testing Station. How many others are there?
There's about a dozen or so. There's about a dozen or so in the UK, and the number is growing because the demand is growing. You know, I think if Dame Judith Hackett's report post Grenfell has taught us anything, it was the need and value of testing and certification. But it doesn't, you know, Paul. It's not just as simple as the test, as Chris has pointed out. From an architect's perspective, it's a far easier ask to actually ask for third-party certification, and of which, you know, a UCAS accredited third-party certification schemes for fire in this country, there aren't that many UCAS accredited organisations. There's probably about 10, I would have thought, that are able to do testing and certification.
Okay, so if we've got a third-party test, would one of those be the BBA?
Well, the BBA certification is slightly different.
Right.
They tend not to cover fire, Paul. They're very well known because they cover a lot of other properties, but actually when it comes to fire, that's not their core competence. And I think, I'm sure they would take me up on this, but they got caught out a little bit by getting involved in fire when it came to Grenfell, or the products that went on to Grenfell. And I think
if I
they
may, I
won't
want to
be
stay.
off what they were.
Right. If I may, I want to stay away from Grenfell because Sir Martin is preparing, is bringing the phase 2 to a close, and we'll hear about Grenfell from that team. I just wanted to focus on the issue of the BBA. I can say now that it is a shock to me that it's not a core aspect of the BBA's work, because their certificates carry information on fire performance, and they tell you whether it is compliant with the guidelines advice in ADB in terms of both UK and European standards. I think many delegates listening will be very surprised that that is not as reliable as we think it is.
Sorry, John. Before we finish, I want to draw our attention to the fact that the government did commission a report on testing and certification of of construction products, which Paul Morell and Annalisa Day produced.
Yeah.
It's been done. It's been sent to government. I've seen a copy, but it's not been released yet. I think there's a ton of recommendations in there, which the government would be folly if they didn't pick up. I think a lot of the topics you're picking up on now, and many of the ones we've covered, are addressed by the recommendations in that report.
Well, I am awaiting that report like you, but I was awaiting it a year ago. So that's interesting. Look, it's been a fascinating session, and I'm actually rather encouraged that we finish it with this big question, because I think we're getting to the very heart of a major problem here. Any closing remarks from you, Jonathan?
Well, I would one thing I would say, the insurance industry put their risk capital on the line when they're insuring buildings, and the insurance industry have looked for third-party certification from the renowned parties in third-party certification, whether that be Warrington or Exover Fire now, ULA in the market, BRE of course, for very many years. And if I was an architect looking for a third-party certificated product, I would go to a specialist third-party fire certification body, and I would endorse Chris's comments. I don't think the insurance industry will be looking at the BBA in the first instance.
And you are. Insurance is terribly important. I get that, absolutely critical, but also our work in terms of ensuring safety for people using buildings is absolutely critical. And the key thing I've got from this conversation is that you're united in your belief, both of you, Jonathan and Chris, that fire certification is a matter of great seriousness. We'd all agree with that, but you should look beyond BBA certification. That's the message that I'm getting clearly.
Go to the specialists.
Right. Well, if nothing else comes from today, that is the most profound piece of information, which I'm sure is going to shock many a delegate, but hopefully it will lead to far better practice as we're working up building designs. Thank you both very much. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And as I said, a bit of a mystery world that existed around this, and you've thrown some very clear light on it. Thank you very much.